The air in Hollow Creek had a peculiar bite that autumn, sharp, metallic, like the forest itself was breathing cold death. The small town sat quietly at the foot of the Black Ridge Mountains, its isolation cushioned by miles of dense pine forest, their needles blackening in the frosty wind. For as long as Alex Reeve could remember, Hollow Creek had always felt haunted by something unseen, an ancient presence that clung to the air like the scent of damp earth and decay. But none of that ever concerned Alex, at least not until the accident. Before that day, he had been a man of science, a retired wildlife biologist who had spent years traveling the world, observing animals and their behaviors. Logic ruled his life, explaining the natural order of things, giving him a sense of control. His work had made him confident, perhaps even arrogant. The stories of the locals, the whispers of dark creatures lurking in the woods, had always seemed like the ramblings of superstitious fools. Then came the accident that took his wife, Ellie. One moment they were hiking a familiar trail up Black Ridge Peak. The next she was gone. It had happened so quickly, like a cruel joke played by the mountain. She had slipped, her screams swallowed by the void, her body disappearing into the jagged ravine below before Alex could even reach out. The authorities recovered her body 3 days later, mangled and broken beyond recognition. The official report claiming it was a tragic misstep. But something in Alex's gut told him there was more to it. He had never believed in the things that others in the town spoke about. The creatures that supposedly prowled the forest at night, the shifting shadows between the trees. But now, in the wake of her death, those stories began creeping into his mind, filling the cracks left by his grief. It was an irrational thought, a desperate man's search for reason, but he couldn't shake it. His wife had been an experienced hiker, cautious, methodical. That trail was as familiar to her as their own home. How could she have slipped so easily? The nightmares started shortly after Ellie's funeral. He would see her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear as she reached for him from the depths of the ravine. And always in the distance there was something else, a shadow that loomed just behind her, too large and misshapen to be human, its eyes glowing red against the darkness. At first, Alex dismissed the dreams as his mind's way of coping with the loss. But the more time he spent alone in their cabin on the outskirts of Hollow Creek, the more the lines between dream and reality began to blur. The once comforting silence of the woods became oppressive, stifling. He started hearing things in the night, branches snapping, leaves crunching underfoot, and the distant sound of something breathing. It was on a particularly cold morning, not long after the first frost had settled over the ground, that Alex found the tracks. They were huge, far larger than any bear he had ever seen, yet they were wrong. The prints had long, clawed toes, their outline strangely human but grotesque, as though something had crawled out of the darkest part of the wilderness. He crouched beside them, tracing the outline with his gloved hand, his breath clouding the cold air. They led away from the edge of his property, disappearing into the thick woods, leaving a trail that made his heart hammer in his chest. The rational part of his mind told him it was just a bear, an abnormally large one, perhaps. But there was something unnerving about the tracks that made his stomach churn with unease. The claws dug deep into the earth, as though the creature had been using its hands to move, almost dragging itself forward. But what was worse were the streaks of red he hadn't noticed before, thin, smeared across the broken twigs and leaves. Blood. Whatever made these tracks wasn't just passing through. It had killed something, something large enough to bleed profusely, though there was no carcass to be found. Not yet. That night, sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling, the crackling fire casting shifting shadows on the walls. His mind replayed the discovery over and over, and with it came Ellie's screams from the dreams, her face twisted in terror as something unseen reached for her from the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those glowing red eyes in the distance, watching him, waiting. The noises outside became impossible to ignore. At first, it was the wind, howling through the trees with a mournful wail. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving just beyond the edges of his property, circling the cabin like a predator waiting for its prey to make a mistake. He lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. Was it just an animal? A bear scavenging for food before the long winter? Or was it something else? And then he heard it. The slow, rhythmic breathing. It was close, so close he could swear it was standing just outside the window. The glass began to frost over, a faint outline of condensation spreading as though something warm was breathing against it from the outside. Alex's pulse quickened as he slid out of bed, careful not to make a sound. He grabbed his flashlight from the nightstand, holding his breath as he clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness like a knife, casting long shadows across the room. Slowly, he moved toward the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The breathing grew louder, more labored, as if whatever was outside was struggling to contain its primal urges. When Alex finally reached the window, he hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay away, to not look. But his curiosity, or maybe his madness, drove him forward. He wiped a small circle of frost from the glass, pressing his face close enough to peer through the murky pane. And then he saw it. It was only for a split second, a glimpse of something enormous, far larger than any bear, its silhouette massive and hunched over, the skin covered in matted hair. But it was the eyes that terrified him most. They were glowing, a deep, burning red that cut through the darkness, staring directly at him with an intelligence that was far beyond that of any animal. Alex stumbled back, dropping the flashlight with a clatter. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away from the window, his mind reeling. The breathing outside had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on him from all sides. He wanted to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a product of his tired, grief-addled mind. But deep down, he knew the truth. Whatever was out there, whatever had been lurking in the shadows of Hollow Creek for all these years, was real, and it was hunting him. The town had whispered of creatures in the woods for generations, but Alex had never believed them. Not until now. He had seen the glowing eyes, felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent, and he knew, without a doubt, that it wasn't going to stop. The nightmares had only just begun. Alex Reeve had always prided himself on his rational mind, his ability to break the natural world down into simple, logical pieces. But after that night, the night when he saw those glowing eyes outside his window, his sense of logic and control began to slip away, fragmenting like shattered glass. The very ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid, no longer trustworthy. The forest outside his cabin, once a place of quiet solace, had turned into a labyrinth of fear. Each rustling leaf, each snapped twig sounded like a sinister promise of what was yet to come. The creature, or whatever it was, had made itself known. It was no longer content to remain a lurking shadow, a mere figment of his troubled mind. It was real, and it wanted him to know it. For days after that first encounter, Alex didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those burning red eyes gleaming in the dark like a pair of malevolent embers. When he wasn't seeing them in his nightmares, he was hearing them in his waking moments, echoing in the distance like a call from something far older than the trees themselves. The sounds outside his cabin grew louder, more deliberate. The footsteps became heavy, methodical, like a hunter pacing just outside the firelight. Sometimes they were accompanied by a deep, low growl, so deep it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of his cabin, shaking him to his core. One night, Alex woke to the sound of scratching. At first, he thought it was just the wind scraping a branch against the roof. But then it grew louder, closer. It was as if claws, huge, monstrous claws, were being dragged across the wooden exterior, testing the cabin's strength, trying to find a way in. He lay in bed, frozen, every muscle locked in fear. The noise went on for what felt like hours, each scrape sending a fresh wave of terror coursing through his veins. When morning finally came, Alex forced himself to investigate. He circled the cabin, rifle in hand, his heart racing as he followed the marks. Deep, jagged lines scored the wooden walls, leading up to his window, his bedroom window. It had been there, just feet away from him while he slept, close enough to reach through the glass and tear him apart. He shuddered at the thought, but it wasn't just the scratches that unnerved him. As he rounded the corner of the cabin, his eyes fell on something that sent a cold chill down his spine. Carved into the dirt right outside his door were more of those massive footprints. They were impossibly large, resembling a human's, but distorted. Long, splayed toes with sharp, thick nails at the end, like a grotesque mockery of human feet. And next to them, half buried in the mud, lay the remains of a half-eaten deer, its ribcage torn open and its organs missing. The message was clear. The creature wasn't just hunting in the woods, it was hunting him. Suspicion and paranoia. Alex's daily hikes, once a routine that brought him peace, became an exercise in terror. He ventured out each day, rifle slung over his shoulder, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of the creature. The air felt thicker, heavier with each passing day, as if the forest itself was alive, watching, conspiring. Each step felt like it was drawing him closer to something he couldn't quite name, something that gnawed at the edge of his sanity. The forest, once a place of comfort and familiarity, had become a hostile, alien landscape. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting into shapes that resembled claws and skeletal hands. The shadows between the trunks seemed deeper, darker, as if they hid things far worse than wild animals. On one of these treks, Alex found something that deepened his dread. He had been following a narrow game trail when he noticed a series of strange markings on the trees. They were arranged in a spiral pattern, carved deep into the bark as if with a sharp tool, or claws. The carvings reminded him of something ancient, something ritualistic, and they filled him with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. It was as though the forest had become the creature's domain, and these symbols were its way of marking its territory. Perhaps they were warnings, or perhaps they were invitations. But what troubled Alex the most wasn't just the carvings. It was the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the creature was there, watching him from the trees, just beyond the edge of his vision. He could feel its presence like a weight on his chest, suffocating, its eyes boring into him even though he couldn't see it. He tried to tell himself that it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that the carvings were nothing more than the product of bored teenagers or local hunters. But deep down, he knew better. Something ancient and malevolent lived in those woods, something that had watched the town of Hollow Creek for centuries. The townspeople were no help. When Alex brought his concerns to the local sheriff, he was met with skeptical eyes and half-hearted reassurances. Bears, they said. Maybe wolves. You're spending too much time alone, Alex. You need to get out of those woods before they drive you mad. But it wasn't the forest driving him mad. It was what lived inside it. A visitor in the dark. One night, as Alex sat by the fire, desperately trying to drown his fear in the warmth of the flames, he heard a noise outside the cabin. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the noise grew louder. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They stopped just outside the door. Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for his rifle, his hands trembling. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. It took every ounce of willpower Alex had not to scream. He sat frozen, staring at the door, praying that whatever was outside would go away. But the knocking continued, each one more insistent than the last. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. For a long time, Alex sat in the silence, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his fingers clutching the rifle so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He didn't move until dawn, when the first rays of light began to creep through the windows. Only then did he rise from his chair, his legs weak and unsteady, and approach the door. The wood was splintered where the knocks had landed, deep indentations that looked like they had been made by something far stronger than any human hand. And there on the threshold was a small pile of stones, arranged in a perfect circle. Alex stared at the stones for what felt like an eternity, his mind reeling. It was a warning, a message from the creature. But what was it trying to tell him? Was it toying with him, testing his resolve, or was it preparing for something far worse? As the days went on, Alex's paranoia grew. He could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. Every shadow in the woods became a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of the creature's return. He slept with his rifle beside him, waking up at the slightest noise, his pulse racing. The isolation of the cabin, once a place of refuge, had become his prison. The creature had him trapped, and it was tightening its grip with each passing day. Alex found himself wondering how long he could last, how long he could hold on to his sanity before the darkness swallowed him whole. In his mind, the line between predator and prey had blurred. He was no longer sure who was hunting whom. And so he waited for the creature to make its next move, knowing that when it came, there would be no more games. The descent into fear had only just begun, and Alex was spiraling deeper into the void, with no way out in sight. The morning air was dense with fog, cold and biting against Alex's skin as he ventured deeper into the woods. His boots crunched through a thin layer of frost, leaving trails of breath that hung in the air like ghosts. He had been walking for hours, though he had no destination in mind. His rifle hung heavy on his shoulder, a weight that reminded him of the danger lurking just beyond the trees. Every shadow seemed to pulse with life, every rustle of leaves a whisper of something watching from the dark. Alex's mind had been unraveling for days, perhaps weeks. He could no longer keep track of time. His dreams bled into waking life, and the forest, his sanctuary and prison alike, became a maze of half-remembered nightmares. Every morning he awoke in a cold sweat, the creature's red eyes burning behind his eyelids. He had tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince himself that his mind was playing tricks on him. But the creature was real. It was out there, and it was getting closer. That morning something felt different. The woods were unnaturally quiet. Even the birds, which usually chirped in the early light, had fallen silent. There was no wind to stir the branches, no movement among the trees. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the smell, foul and thick, like rotting meat left out in the sun. Alex wrinkled his nose in disgust, his stomach churning as the stench filled his lungs. He had smelled death before, during his years studying wildlife. But this was different. It was heavier, almost suffocating, as if the very air had turned rancid. He followed the scent without thinking, driven by equal parts dread and curiosity. As he crept through the underbrush, he noticed the trees around him had been torn apart. The bark was shredded, long gashes crisscrossing their surfaces like the marks of some enormous claw. The ground was littered with fallen branches, their ends splintered as though they had been snapped in half by something with immense strength. And then he found it. The bear's body lay sprawled across the forest floor, a hulking mass of fur and flesh, twisted and broken. Its chest had been torn open, its rib cage cracked wide, exposing the bloodied remains of its organs. Its massive head lolled to the side, its jaws frozen in a grotesque snarl. Alex stood frozen, staring at the grizzly's mutilated corpse, bile rising in his throat. This bear was enormous, one of the largest he had ever seen in his years of studying wildlife. But what disturbed him most wasn't the bear's size or even the brutality of its death. It was the way the body had been arranged. The limbs had been positioned carefully, almost methodically, as though by some ritualistic hand. The bear's bones were stacked in spirals around the body, its flesh carved into shapes Alex didn't recognize but could feel deep in his gut. It was a message. This wasn't just the work of an animal. It was deliberate, controlled, sentient. The creature had done this. Alex swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he gripped his rifle tighter. He scanned the trees around him, heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't see anything, just the endless, suffocating wall of trees. But he could feel it, that same weight pressing down on him, that same oppressive presence watching from the shadows. The creature was here, somewhere. A twig snapped behind him. Alex spun around, raising his rifle instinctively, his heart hammering in his ears. The forest was still again, but now the air had shifted. It was colder, the fog thickening like a living thing, wrapping itself around him. His breath came in short gasps as his eyes darted around, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. And then there it was. It stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible through the fog. At first, Alex thought it was another tree, a tall, looming silhouette in the distance. But as it moved, the shape became clearer. The creature was massive, standing well over 9 feet tall, its body hunched and covered in thick, matted fur. Its arms were long, almost unnaturally so, ending in hands with claws that glistened in the faint light. But its face was what froze Alex to the spot. The creature's eyes glowed with that same malevolent red light he had seen so many nights before. Its face was a twisted blend of human and beast, with features that seemed both familiar and alien. Its skin was leathery and scarred, pulled tight over its skull, and its mouth was filled with jagged yellow teeth that gleamed as it grinned at him. For a moment, Alex couldn't move, his body locked in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. The creature stared at him, unblinking, its chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. It was waiting, watching him with an intelligence far beyond that of any animal. Alex's fingers tightened around the trigger of his rifle, his mind screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. But before he could act, the creature took a step forward. The ground trembled beneath its weight, the air vibrating with a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within its chest. It took another step, its enormous frame moving with a terrifying grace. And then, with a speed that defied its size, it charged. Alex barely had time to react. He raised the rifle, firing off a shot that echoed through the trees. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, but it didn't slow. It barely even flinched. Alex stumbled backward, his heart racing as he fired again, the sound of the gunfire reverberating in his skull. This time, the shot hit the creature square in the chest, but still, it kept coming. The creature was almost upon him when something unexpected happened. From somewhere deeper in the forest, a roar cut through the fog, deep and thunderous, shaking the ground beneath Alex's feet. For a split second, the creature hesitated, its glowing eyes shifting towards the source of the noise. It was a bear's roar, louder and more ferocious than anything Alex had ever heard. Before Alex could make sense of what was happening, a massive shape barreled out of the trees. A grizzly, just as large as the one whose body lay mutilated on the forest floor. It collided with the creature in a violent crash of muscle and fur, the force of the impact sending both of them sprawling to the ground. For a brief moment, Alex could do nothing but watch as the two beasts tore into each other with primal fury. The grizzly roared again, its massive claws raking across the creature's hide, tearing fur and flesh in thick, bloody strips. But the creature fought back with equal ferocity, its claws slashing at the bear's throat, its jaws snapping at the thick fur. The ground shook beneath their struggle, the air filled with the sound of growls, snarls, and the sickening crack of bones. Alex stood frozen, rifle clutched uselessly in his hands, his mind struggling to process the chaos unfolding before him. It was a battle of titans, a fight that felt ancient, primal, like something from the dawn of time. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The bear let out one final roar, its voice echoing through the trees before it collapsed to the ground, its massive body heaving with labored breaths. Blood soaked the forest floor, pooling beneath the bear's body as it lay motionless. The creature stood over the fallen grizzly, its breath coming in ragged gasps. It was wounded. Deep gashes crisscrossed its body, its dark fur matted with blood, but it was still standing. It let out a low, rumbling growl, its glowing eyes locking onto Alex once more. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Alex's heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming at him to run, to flee from this nightmare. But he couldn't. He was rooted to the spot, held captive by those burning red eyes. The creature took a step toward him, its massive form looming over him like a shadow of death. But instead of attacking, it did something Alex hadn't expected. It spoke. "You do not belong here." The voice was low, guttural, barely more than a growl. But it was unmistakably a voice. The words echoed in Alex's mind, sending a wave of cold terror through his body. He stumbled backward, his legs finally obeying his commands. But before he could turn and run, the creature stepped back into the shadows, its body blending into the fog as though it had never been there. For a moment, Alex stood alone in the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear lay dead at his feet, the forest once again silent. But the creature was still out there, watching, waiting. The encounter was over. But Alex knew, deep in his soul, that it wasn't finished. The silence of the forest was absolute. It pressed in on Alex from all sides, thick and suffocating, wrapping around him like a shroud. He stood in the clearing, rooted to the spot, staring at the bloodied ground where the grizzly had fallen. The fog had begun to roll in again, swirling around his feet, erasing the outlines of the trees and turning the world into a cold, featureless void. The creature was gone now, vanished back into the forest's dark heart, but its presence lingered like a phantom, filling the air with a crushing sense of dread. He was alone. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, each one a struggle against the weight of the terror that had seized his chest. The rifle hung useless in his hands, its barrel still warm from the frantic shots that had done nothing. His mind raced, desperate to make sense of what had just happened, but nothing made sense anymore. Everything he had known, everything he had believed had been shattered in a matter of moments. The creature, the thing that had stalked him for weeks, that had haunted his dreams, was real. It was intelligent. It was ancient. And worst of all, it was still out there, somewhere in the fog, watching him, waiting for whatever game it had started to play itself out. The words it had spoken echoed in his mind, their guttural tones reverberating through him like the tolling of a distant, dreadful bell. "You do not belong here." But what did it mean? Why had it spoken to him? Why had it let him live? And what did it want? Alex took a step back, his foot slipping on the blood-slicked ground. He caught himself on a tree, his fingers digging into the rough bark as he fought to keep his balance. His thoughts churned, a storm of fear and confusion. But through it all, one thought rose above the others, clear and cold. He couldn't stay here, not in these woods, not in Hollow Creek. Whatever had begun, whatever dark force had been unleashed, it was beyond his understanding, beyond anything he could face alone. If he stayed, it would come for him again, and next time it wouldn't leave him alive. His mind screamed at him to run, but even as he turned to flee, a new sound pierced the stillness of the forest, a soft, rhythmic rustling, like the whisper of leaves on the wind. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until Alex could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. Footsteps. His breath caught in his throat as he spun around, scanning the fog for any sign of movement. His pulse quickened, his heart slamming against his ribs. The creature couldn't be back already. It couldn't. He backed away, his eyes darting frantically from shadow to shadow, but he saw nothing. Just the thick, choking fog closing in on him like a living thing. And then, from the gloom, a figure emerged. At first, Alex couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The form was human, tall, with broad shoulders and a familiar gait, but it didn't move like any man he had ever known. Its steps were slow, deliberate, and as it drew closer, Alex's stomach clenched with a deep, primal fear. The figure stepped into the clearing and Alex's breath caught in his throat. It was Ellie, or at least it looked like Ellie. She stood there in the mist, her body half obscured by the fog, her face pale and expressionless. Her dark hair hung limp around her shoulders, streaked with mud and leaves, and her eyes, those eyes that had once been so full of life, were cold, empty. They glowed faintly in the dim light, not red like the creatures, but something else, something far more unsettling. It was as if the forest had taken her, remade her in its own image, twisted her into something that was no longer human. Alex felt his knees buckle, the world spinning around him. He stumbled back, his hands trembling as he raised his rifle. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching him, its lips parting slightly as though it was trying to speak. But no words came. Instead, a low, inhuman growl rumbled deep within her chest, a sound that didn't belong to the woman he had once loved. The sound sent a fresh wave of terror crashing through him, and he took another step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "No," he gasped, his voice trembling. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." But she took a step closer, her head tilting slightly to one side as though she was studying him. There was something horribly wrong about the way she moved, too stiff, too mechanical, like a marionette on strings. Her eyes, those dead, glowing eyes, locked onto his, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something familiar, something that had once been Ellie. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, empty stare of whatever thing now stood in front of him. "Ellie!" Alex cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please talk to me. What happened to you?" She didn't answer. She only took another step forward, her movements jerky, unnatural. The growl deepened, rising in her throat, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile. Alex felt his stomach churn, bile rising in his throat as the truth began to dawn on him. This wasn't Ellie. This was something else, something dark and malevolent, wearing her face like a mask. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. His hands tightened on the rifle, his knuckles white, but he couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. He couldn't shoot her. Even though he knew it wasn't really her, he couldn't do it. The thought of putting a bullet through the thing that wore his wife's face was too much, too horrifying to contemplate. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice breaking. The figure lunged. In a flash, Alex was thrown backward, the force of the impact knocking the rifle from his hands. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs as the creature, Ellie, pinned him down. Her hands were ice cold, her nails digging into his skin with a strength that didn't belong to a human. He gasped for air, struggling to free himself, but she was too strong. Her face hovered inches from his, her dead eyes boring into him with a hunger that sent waves of revulsion through his body. The growl turned into a snarl, her lips peeling back to reveal sharp, yellowed teeth. Alex's heart raced as her grip tightened, squeezing the life from his chest. He clawed at the ground, his vision blurring, the edges of his world darkening as his strength ebbed away. And then, in the distance, another sound broke through the chaos. A deep, thunderous roar. The creature, the real creature, was coming. The thing that wore Ellie's face faltered for a split second, its grip loosening just enough for Alex to wrench himself free. He rolled away, gasping for breath, his chest heaving as he scrambled to his feet. The fog had thickened around him, But through the mist, he could see the shape of the creature emerging, its glowing red eyes cutting through the gloom like twin beacons of death. It was coming for him. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, the sound reverberating through the trees and shaking the very ground beneath Alex's feet. The thing that had been Ellie hissed in response, its eyes narrowing as it turned to face the new threat. For a moment, the two monsters stood there, sizing each other up, their growls filling the air with the promise of violence. And then, they attacked. The collision of flesh and fur was deafening, a brutal clash of titans that sent shockwaves through the forest. Alex stumbled backward, his legs weak and unsteady, as the two creatures tore into each other with savage fury. He watched in horror as they fought, their claws raking through skin, their teeth snapping at flesh. Blood splattered across the ground, the sounds of battle echoing through the mist. Alex didn't wait to see who would win. He turned and ran, his legs carrying him as fast as they could through the fog, his heart pounding in his ears. The sounds of the fight grew distant behind him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He ran until his lungs burned, until his muscles screamed in protest, until the fog began to thin and the trees started to part. And then, suddenly, he was out of the woods, out of the nightmare. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. The fog still lingered at the edges of the trees, but it no longer reached for him, no longer clung to him like a living thing. The forest was behind him now, its horrors contained within the shadows. But the memory of the creature's red eyes, of Ellie's twisted face, would never leave him. As Alex lay there, staring up at the pale sky, a single thought echoed in his mind, a thought that chilled him to the bone. It's not over, because deep down he knew the truth. He had escaped the forest, but the creature, whatever dark, ancient force had taken hold of Hollow Creek, was still out there, and it wasn't done with him yet, not by a long shot.